Hi everyone, this is Intro to Africa at Flagler College. I'm Dr. Young. This lecture covers a fair amount of material today. Hopefully we can get through it in a timely manner and this won't be too long. I want to talk about the spread of Christianity and Islam in Africa through the first few centuries of each of those religions' existence on the continent. These are tremendously important forces in Africa, historically as well as in the present day. And it's important to acknowledge religion as a historical factor, that people took these things seriously, that often this was the most influential component of the culture of a region, of an area, even of an individual village or town. And so we have to understand kind of the broad context for this, and then as we read Sunjata, and as we look at later in the semester at the book Things Fall Apart, we'll consider the impact that religion has on people. And that's not just Christianity and Islam. Of course, African peoples had their own religions, worshiped their own gods, had their own rituals, and their own kind of teachings about those gods and about the forces of nature and so forth and so on. And so Africa is a really rich place for the clash of religions all through its history. I want to start with Christianity and look at this. The spread of this religion into Africa regionally. I first want to look at Egypt. Alexandria, by the 3rd and 4th centuries CE, had become one of the most important centers for Christianity. In the 3rd century, for instance, Saint Anthony was one of the first, and he is seen really as kind of the founder, one of the first Christians to go into the desert and to set up his own life as a hermit, dedicated entirely to God. This is the sort of lifestyle that evolves in Christianity into monasticism, into the life of the monastery, which was really the key form of life for Christendom for much of its history. At least all the way through late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, well into the Middle Ages, into the High Middle Ages in Europe, and in other parts of the world, tremendously important also for Christianity. Egypt really is the birthplace of Christian monasticism, and there are all sorts of legends associated with Anthony, that he went out in the desert and found another hermit there named Paul, who is also seen as a kind of founding figure. You can see the image on the left side of the slide here is a Greek icon of Anthony, and sort of telling his story. Here he is going out in the desert and meeting Paul, and other parts of that story. Now, Egypt also was a key contributor to the development of orthodoxy in Christianity, and I'm really kind of glossing over a lot of this. I teach Western Civ as well, and if you're interested in these topics, I cover them in a great bit more detail there, as well as in some of my upper division classes. But Alexandria was important, for instance, because Bishop Athanasius, who was the Bishop of Alexandria in the early 4th century, was the leading figure behind the theology formulated at the Council of Nicaea, one of the formative councils of the Christian Church, the one that put into place the Nicene Creed that was called by the Emperor Constantine, as Christianity really took hold as the main cultural phenomenon in Rome. And so Egypt contributed a great deal to that. However, by the 5th century or so, much of the Egyptian Christian community had, in a sense, broken away from the Orthodox formulation of Christianity. There was a great fragmentation in Eastern Christendom of different theological teachings, different ritual uh, ways of worshiping, ritual systems and liturgies and things like this. And the Coptic Church, or the Egyptian Christian Church, is one of the most radical of these. The Coptic theologians produced a number of texts, for instance, that ran counter to the Orthodox tradition in more ways than we really have space here to enumerate. There was a collection of these Coptic texts, some of which dated probably back long before the 5th century, but were preserved by the Coptic Church at a place called Nag Hammadi in Egypt in the 1940s, I believe, and maybe 1950s. Anyway, the Nag Hammadi Library has become this incredible repository for the study of early Christianity and for the diversity of early Christianity in different parts of the Christian world. And Egypt seems to be a really interesting outlier to the Orthodox faith. Now, other parts of North Africa also play a role in the spread of early Christianity. It's in North Africa, for instance, that what is now Algeria and Tunisia, that during the late 3rd century, there were massive persecutions of Christians, and in North Africa, it seems that this persecution took on a particular vehemence. I mean, that wasn't the only place where it was pretty bad, but the North African Christians in particular adopted this concept of martyrdom as the most sure way to get to heaven, that if one suffers the life, or rather the death of a martyr, then one has a pretty sure ticket to get into heaven. And after the Roman Empire embraced Christianity, and Constantine, in collaboration with Athanasius, began to put into place this Orthodox Christian system, there were many of these North African Christians who would embrace this whole concept of martyrdom, who fought against that, in fact, arguing that many of the priests who were the purveyors of the Orthodox tradition were willing to, or in some cases even had given in to the demands of the Romans during the persecution, that they had sort of turned coat on Christianity for a time, and were thus not worthy to be counted with the Christians. And so we have this whole movement called the Donatists in North Africa, who attain or have this sense that they are the truly chosen Christians. And the Donatists become a heretical group, a heresy, because they are fighting against the Orthodox clergy and really giving them problems for a time. Now, later in the 4th century and into the early 5th century, North Africa did become a center for Christian intellectual activity, especially during the time of St. Augustine, or St. Augustine, if you want to say it that way. Augustine was the bishop of Hippo, which is in modern-day Tunisia. And Augustine, of all of the figures in Western Christianity, Latin-speaking Christianity, is arguably the most important theologian, at least in antiquity. He is also a tremendous philosopher. He embraced a lot of the ideas of Plato, as redacted through the Neoplatonists, and applied the Platonic philosophy to the formulation of Christian theology. And so there's a kind of hybrid that's formed out of that. And Augustine's theology is one of the most influential bodies of theological material that has ever been written in the Christian tradition. Augustine really is the church father of the highest reputation all through the Middle Ages, and even into the more recent periods. The Protestant Reformation harkened back in many ways to Augustine, embraced the teachings of Augustine, rejecting theologians like Thomas Aquinas who came after him. And so anyway, there's a lot more we could say about this, but all of this is to say that North Africa really is a site for a great deal of important stuff that's happening in the development of Christianity. Now, moving a bit, one of the things that we have to understand about Christianity and eventually about Islam as well, as we'll talk about, is that this is hardly a unified movement. That by the 4th and 5th centuries, Christianity has spread all over the Mediterranean, all through North Africa, and even down the Red Sea coast, all the way to this region just across from South Arabia here, what is, into the Horn of Africa, really, what is now modern-day Eritrea. And that doesn't mean that the form that Christianity took in this area was equivalent to the Roman form or the Greek form. It took on its own characteristics as it spread into this area. And so the early Ethiopian Christian church, which is what I want to talk about now, is this important center for Christianity, but it differs in many, many respects to the Christianity of other regions of the Christian world. The scholar Peter Brown, probably the leading scholar of late antiquity in existence, formulated the term micro-Christianities to talk about the Christianity of this the period of late antiquity, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries, saying that really Christianity splits, or as it spreads, it takes on kind of regional and local characteristics that differ from the Christianities of other places. And so we can't talk about a unified movement of any kind. Really, this is open to local adaptation, right? One of the most interesting of those local adaptations occurs in this region. The ancient kingdom of Aksum, the forerunner of the kingdom of Ethiopia, and we'll come back in another lecture or two to Ethiopia in the Middle Ages, where Christianity continues to develop. But there was this ancient kingdom, sorry for the yawn, ancient kingdom down here, again in what is now modern-day Eritrea, along the Red Sea coast. This is an area that partook in trade with South Arabia, a great deal of trading happening in this area, and into the Gulf of Aden here, right, between the Red Sea and the other parts of the Indian Ocean over here. But anyway, the kingdom of Aksum received Christian missionaries probably as early as the 4th century. There was a legend that a Greek missionary named Frumentius went to Ethiopia and converted to Aksum. I shouldn't call it Ethiopia at this point, but went to Aksum and converted the king of Aksum, whose name was Ezana. This tablet, which I believe is written in the Ethiopian language of Ge'ez. Ge'ez, in fact, becomes a kind of sacred Christian language in the Ethiopian tradition. Lots of theological works are written in Ge'ez historically. But this tablet, which is still preserved in Ethiopia from a much earlier period, details the conversion of King Ezana. Now, the thing, Ethiopia has been Christian since the 4th century in an unbroken line. So Christianity in Ethiopia is as ancient as it is in, say, Egypt, or nearly as ancient as it is in Egypt, or in Greece, or other parts of the Mediterranean, right? That this was one place that received this very early. However, because its location was rather remote, it did not have to deal with the really kind of the monitoring from the Greek world, especially from Constantinople, as of the late 4th and 5th centuries, where Constantinople becomes really kind of the capital and the main center for Eastern Orthodox Christianity. And so Ethiopia is free to develop along its own lines. There are records that once in a while, maybe once in a generation or so, a Greek missionary or a Greek bishop or monk or somebody would show up in Ethiopia and kind of, you know, make sure that they were not going too far afield, but simply the difficulty of transportation to such a remote region, at least for the Greek-speaking world, again meant that Ethiopia did its own thing, right? Now, in the early Middle Ages, starting in the 7th century, in fact, almost dating all the way back to the life of Muhammad, who died in 632. Okay, Islam spread all through South Arabia, and of course the Muslims were not content to simply stop at the coast here. They crossed the Red Sea, moving into the Horn of Africa, into the land controlled by the Kingdom of Aksum. And so these military incursions were then followed by, some conversions of people to Islam, and eventually by migrations of peoples from South Arabia, from Egypt, and other places who had converted to Islam. And it's at this point where the Christian Kingdom of Aksum has to make a difficult choice to abandon its historic heartland and move further to the south and west into the highlands, where they could protect themselves better from the Muslim incursions. If they wanted to maintain their Christian identity, they were forced to do this. Now, historically, Ethiopia has tried to maintain a claim to all of this coastland here. This is one of the factors in the rivalry since the creation of Eritrea, the rivalry between Ethiopia and Eritrea, which sort of continues on to the present, even though there have been some peace treaties signed and other things. But this goes all the way back for really to kind of the early Middle Ages, and the Islamic incursion. Eritrea is almost entirely Islamic, forcing the Christians further to the west. Christianity also spread into Nubia, which of course is north of here, what is now Sudan, along the Nile River. And in this case, there was a great deal more contact with the Byzantine or Greek Eastern Orthodox world and the Egyptian Coptic Christian world. You can see, for instance, from this fresco here, from a Christian church in Nubia called the Cathedral of Faras, that here we have, a native Nubian clergyman, a bishop or something like that, and yet the saint, as I assume this is Mary and Jesus, is depicted as, with light skin, right, as a Mediterranean person or a European person. And so the artwork here shows the influence of the Greek world. This was a place that was much more closely tied to that than the Ethiopian world was. Now, when Islam made its way into Nubia, the Nubian Christians, although they held on for some time, eventually most of Nubia, it took many centuries, but most of Nubia was converted to Islam, I should say. There's really not a lot of remnants, if any remnants, of this ancient Christian tradition left in Nubia, although it also dates back to a very, very early period. So Islam, as it is with Ethiopia, is a major threat. In this case, the Kingdom of Aksum doesn't, or rather these political entities in Nubia don't pick up and move. Instead, they don't weather the storm nearly as well as the Ethiopians do. Okay, so that's our discussion of Christianity, really kind of up to about the year, about the year 1000 or so, through the early Middle Ages. I will pick up a discussion, as I said, of Ethiopia into the Zagwe dynasty and into the Solomonic rulers. So that's 12th and 13th and 14th centuries in a later lecture. Now, if Christianity did have a place even very early in Africa, Islam ultimately would win out in terms of simply the amount of land, the spread of the influence that the religion had. Right, there are some Christian centers in Africa, like Ethiopia over here. Some Christians did maintain their religion in Egypt and Nubia, and up here, even in other parts of North Africa. But these regions you see here in various colors are historically and contemporarily part of the Muslim world, right? You can see the basic timeline here in the different colors. So, by the middle of the 8th century, the end of the Umayyad Caliphate, as it's called, all of the Arabian Peninsula over here into Persia, even into the borders of India, and up here, to the Aral Sea and the region that is now Afghanistan, right? And all the way up here to pushing back area that had been controlled by the Byzantine Empire up to the middle of the 7th century when the Muslims defeated them. So all through the Levant region and Syria, up here into the Caucasus between the Black and Caspian Seas, and then across the Sinai Peninsula and all through Lower Egypt, across North Africa, and even into Iberia. By 750, all of this land had been conquered. And then, Islam continues to spread across the desert, though somewhat more slowly. By 1100, it's down here into the upper bend of the Niger River and nearly to Lake Chad. So this region that is now, modern day Mali, Burkina Faso, northern Nigeria, the part of the Sahel that is livable, especially along the river here, right? That becomes Muslim by about 1100 or so, and it spreads even further. Though this contact zone, as we'll see, is more complicated. It spreads all through Nubia here, and then the east coast of Africa as well is quite early. Some parts of it, into the Horn of Africa by 900 or so have been converted to Islam, what is now Somalia, parts there. And then down the east coast and even onto the island of Madagascar here, right? So we're going to talk about each of these regions and the story of Islam in those places. If you are unfamiliar with the origins of Islam, I would encourage you to look it up. Even reading a Wikipedia page on, the history of Islam or the life of Muhammad and the early caliphs would be helpful, right? Suffice it to say that the career of Muhammad takes place in Western Arabia, especially in the city of Mecca, and for a time in this other city north of that called Medina. And Muhammad is believed to be the prophet of God, the final prophet of God. The Muslims do embrace the notion that the Jewish and Christian prophets were real, legitimate prophets, but that the traditions were corrupted by their followers after their lives. And so Muhammad is what they call the seal of the prophets, the last of God's prophets who delivered the unadulterated word via the Quran, the holy text of Islam, right? And this is the movement that spreads out of the Arabian Peninsula via conquest mostly into much of, into all of this area that you see here, a vast network of connected regions, regions connected by the religion of Islam, and some of it even, pretty much this stuff in The orange color here was for a time, up until the early 9th century or so, even united under a single political entity called the Abbasid Caliphate. And so, although that falls apart, that fragments quickly, there is this notion of the unity of all Muslims, that they ought to be unified under a figure called the Caliph. Caliph means successor, and by that they mean successor to Muhammad, successor to the Prophet of God. And we're going to see a number of figures all through African history who lay claim to the title of Caliph. Some of the more important ones, in fact, in fairly recent eras, the 19th and 20th, and even into the 21st century. Now, Egypt was a Roman territory, of course, up to the first half of the 7th century. First Rome, and then the Eastern Roman Empire, controlled by the capital city of Constantinople, and the emperors there. Egypt was one of the first places, though, that was lost to the Muslim invasions, although it had been an important center for Rome all through its history of Roman rule. The Romans simply were not able to stop the spread of Islam, the conquests that were taking place. So the Arabs conquered Egypt in the 7th century and put into place a set of guidelines for the coexistence of Muslims, a kind of thin caste of Muslim elites who were mostly warriors, although there were eventually some nobles and scholars and other people who settled in Egypt. But they put into place this thing called the Pact of Umar, which is really a set of guidelines for Christians and Jews, and in Persia for Zoroastrians, who were all considered by the Muslims to be what are called people of the book. This means, again, that Muslims believe that Christians and Jews and Zoroastrians worshipped God in ways that were certainly more legitimate than pagans did. They worshipped a single God. Monotheism is tremendously important for Islam. Their tradition was inspired originally, though it had been corrupted. And so, they had a policy, and some of this even is found in the Holy Quran. They had a policy of toleration and coexistence. Although the Christians were forbidden from actively proselytizing, trying to spread their religion, they were forbidden from, doing things essentially that would stop Islam from progressing, stop people from converting to Islam and things like that. But they were otherwise tolerated and allowed to continue their coexistence. They did have to pay higher taxes. It wasn't like they were on equal terms or anything like that. And gradually, although Christians continued, and Jews for that matter, continued to exist in Egypt for many centuries. In fact, all the way to the present, Egypt probably has a population that's about 5% Christian or so, even in the present day. The motivation, the incentives certainly were to convert to Islam and, thus receive the economic and social and political privileges that came along with that conversion. And so, over time, the majority of the population of Egypt converts to Islam, and this is true for most of the areas that are dominated by the Muslim religion. Now, there is a survival of the Christian church there, though it continues to be rather different in its theology and its some of its ritual practices and other things. The Coptic Church is the Coptic Orthodox Church, as it's called, is quite different from other Christian sects. But it does survive in Egypt, and continues to form an important kind of minority group in Egyptian history. Now, starting in the, I think it's about the 9th century or so, there's a group called the Fatimids who break away from the Abbasid Caliphate. These are all Muslims. The Fatimids had been warriors, and they take over Egypt and declare a kind of independence from the Caliph in Baghdad, which was the capital city of the Abbasid Caliphate. And they found a city called Cairo, and I don't think I need to tell you about Cairo. It's still one of the biggest cities in Africa, one of the biggest cities in the world for that matter. And Cairo quickly grows up to be a trading center that rivals Alexandria and eventually kind of eclipses Alexandria as the most important population center and economic center in Egypt. Now, another chapter in the history of Egyptian Islam, and really this is all just kind of hit the highlights sort of stuff here, okay? But during the Crusade period, Egypt becomes an important staging point, first of all, for the reconquest of the Holy Land after the Christians seized it from the Muslims in the First Crusade. The figure known as Salah ad-Din or Saladin, pictured here at the top right of the slide, starts a dynasty. He was actually not from here. He was from northern Mesopotamia, or he was a Kurd. But he starts a dynasty there called the Ayyubid dynasty. And Egypt was, as I said, really the political center that controlled the Holy Land. And this was the area that kind of was the command post for the fight against the Christians during the Crusade period. The European Christians did understand this and even tried to invade Egypt a couple of times. The Crusades of King Louis IX of France in the 13th century, there were two of them, in fact, were all about taking Egypt and thus, taking away the controlling force of the Holy Land. Both of those crusades failed. Though the first of these, Louis actually made it some way into Egypt, but then kind of got stranded in the Nile Delta because he didn't know how to navigate it, and he was surrounded eventually by the Muslim forces there. In the 13th century, 13th and 14th century, I guess, there was a group called the Mamluks who had previously been of servile status, almost slave status. But they overthrew the Ayyubids, or I can't remember whether there was an intermediate dynasty here anyway. And the Mamluks really, for the last couple of centuries, the Middle Ages, were the dominant force in Egypt, and until it was taken over by the Ottomans, something we'll get to much later in the course, right? Now, during the Middle Ages, international trade ran through Egypt. This is Cairo in particular was one of the key centers for international trade, really to get goods from the East, from India and indirectly from China, Southeast Asia, and other places. There really were just a couple of options that merchants had. They could take what was called the Silk Road, which is an overland road through the Middle East, that ran up through, through Baghdad. Beirut was an important center close to the Eastern Mediterranean Sea there, that constituted an important trading center at the kind of western edge of the Silk Road. The other option really was to go, through the Indian Ocean, either through the Persian Gulf, and then up the Tigris and Euphrates rivers to Baghdad, and then maybe overland via the Silk Road to Beirut, or to go through the Red Sea, through the Gulf of Aden, through the Red Sea, up to Cairo, and then from points to points beyond, right, to trade with Europe. And so Cairo, was one of these key trading centers in that vast network. We can talk even about the globalization of world trade in the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries, that there are goods in demand coming from both west and east, trading with the other part of the world, And Cairo really is one of these places. It's right in the middle of all of that. Now, Islam also spread across North Africa. In other words, west of Egypt, and this area would be both an important center of Islam and also a place that began to challenge the prevailing order of Islam. Because there was conflict from the beginning between the Arabs, who were kind of nomadic invaders, moving into this territory, bringing this religion, and the native nomadic peoples of North Africa, Northwest Africa, who were called the Berbers, right? And these are the same people who had both traded and fought with the Romans in the ancient period, and carried on trade across the Sahara and all of that. And so to understand the phenomena we see here, I want to refer to one of the most important social thinkers / philosophers of all time, someone who did live in North Africa for some of his life, but also spent some time in Spain and Egypt and other places. This is the 14th century philosopher Ibn Khaldun. Actually, truth be told, I think this image may not be of Saladin. It may be Ibn Khaldun. Saladin, I think, would be pictured with weapons. So I think this image is Ibn Khaldun. Anyway, I can't remember which of these. When I put this slideshow together some semesters ago, which one I was intending. But Ibn Khaldun, in his most important work, which was a work of history called the Muqaddimah, noted a pattern that he felt explained much of history. Okay, so let me give you what is known as the Khaldunian model, at least in its kind of raw outline here. So Ibn Khaldun wrote, and got a lot of this from observing the political conditions during his lifetime, and in sort of his contemporary circumstances anyway, in North Africa and Spain. He said, history is defined largely by the conflict between sedentary agriculturalists and nomadic pastoralists. Okay? So we have the sedentary agriculturalists who live in the same place, who farm their crops, and because of the amount of food that they're able to grow, the surpluses that they create via agriculture, they are able to produce a robust culture, a kind of permanent culture. However, being sedentary and agricultural means that they also become, in his view, soft. In other words, they lose their greatest capacity for war because the sedentary lifestyle is easy, as he sees it. Now, this all changes when a nomadic group, now nomads, he says, are not like that at all. They have to move around. They have to ride their animals. They often have to impinge on land, say oases and things that are controlled by other peoples, and so they're constantly fighting or constantly training for war and practicing the arts of war. And so nomadic peoples are going to be a great deal more warlike and effective at prosecuting war. Okay. Now, in Ibn Khaldun's mind, the definitive kind of conflict in world history comes when the nomadic group invades the land controlled by the agricultural group. Why would they want to invade? Well, because the agricultural society is wealthy, right? The surplus crops and things make them wealthy. They've got, liquid wealth in the form of precious metals and jewels and fine textiles and other things like that. And so the nomads want to get in on that, right? So they raid and overcome the agriculturalists and set themselves up as the rulers of the agricultural society. So we now have this thin caste of nomadic, or rather now formerly nomadic elites who have conquered the agricultural society. All right. Now, the problem is the nomads themselves don't really have a robust culture, and so they quickly become assimilated. The appeal of the agricultural society and the culture that it produces means that they quickly abandon their old way of life and embrace the sedentary way of life. And thus, over a generation or two, they also become soft, right? And so they are drawn into and assimilated into the agricultural society, even though they technically have conquered it and are ruling it, right? Now you can probably guess what happens next. The next nomadic group comes in. They're not yet assimilated or tainted by the agricultural dominant culture, right? And so they come in and conquer and set themselves up as the ruler and then become assimilated as well. And so we have this whole circle. And Ibn Khaldun said that is the definitive kind of dialectic of history here, right? This cycle of nomadic conquest and then assimilation and then next nomadic conquest and assimilation and rinse and repeat over and over and over again is how things have happened, right? Now, this is, I think, an effective way to describe a lot of things in world history. It doesn't really matter which area of the world we're talking about. This same process has been in effect for much of world history. It is particularly applicable to the region of North Africa in the Islamic era. I guess that's post-Islamic conquest, I should say. That the Arabs were initially the nomadic conquerors of this area, but then they settled down and became assimilated and soft, so to speak, sedentary. And so various Berber groups then end up conquering different parts of North Africa. Now, the other thing that we have to add to this, and I am truthfully uncertain whether Ibn Khaldun deals with this, is that recent converts to a religion tend to be the most committed and the most insistent that the religion be lived to the letter. In other words, recent converts tend to be more fundamentalist in their approach than people who have been in their religion for a long time, for generations, who maybe have become lax in that observance. Now, I say recent converts, I don't necessarily mean, conversion from another religion, though that may be the case. It may be that they have a kind of conversion experience where they've been living, kind of only half living the religion. They have a profound experience and thus become incredibly committed, right? But in the case of the Berbers, these nomadic peoples, much like the Arabs had done some generations before, embraced the religion of Islam, and as recent converts, tended to be very strict and fundamentalist in their observance. Okay. And so we're going to see these fundamentalist Berber groups kind of influence the course of North African history a couple of times. With the Arab conquests, the North Africa was made into a province of first the Umayyad Caliphate and then the Abbasid Caliphate, known as Ifriqiya. This is Arabic for Africa. Okay. And the main center, really kind of the political capital of Ifriqiya, which was under the control during the Abbasid Caliphate of a figure called the Emir. Now, the word Emir means something like lieutenant of the Caliph. There are still, of course, emirs or emirates as political entities in the Middle East today. We're going to see caliphates and emirates in other parts of African history as well. But Ifriqiya is an emirate controlled by an emir under the broad rule of the caliph for a time. And the city of Kairouan was the capital, the residence of the emir. Okay, and Kairouan develops quickly into an important trading center. However, by the 11th century, fundamentalist Berbers had taken over Kairouan, really kind of render it into a shell of itself. Anyway, I don't want to go into the details there necessarily, but Kairouan it flourishes as the main kind of economic and political center of North Africa for a couple of centuries until it is damaged pretty badly, right? Now, in the 11th, well, really into the 12th century, there was another Berber fundamentalist group called the Almoravids, who take a very hardline stance, fundamentalist stance on Islam. One of their kind of calling cards is their insistence that everyone live this strict version of Islam, strictly to the letter of the Quran. They are similar in a lot of ways to, some of the fundamentalist groups in Islam that we see today, in their insistence on the absolute strict observance, right? But their political capital is much further to the west in the city that's called Marrakesh. The picture at the lower right of the slide here is of the famous night market of Marrakesh, something that has been in operation for about a millennium at this point. And so Marrakesh, in what is now Morocco, was built by the Almoravids. And over time, the Almoravids kind of loosen their take on Islam. This is one of the things that tends to happen with fundamentalist groups, is that they, as the generations pass, the commitment wanes a bit. And in the 13th and 14th centuries, another group called the Almohads, and again another Berber Muslim group, inspired by kind of a conversion to a different form of Islam, defeats the Almoravids, and the Almohads take over Spain and North Africa, and life becomes a bit more diffuse there. There isn't necessarily a strong political capital under the Almohads, and the form of Islam known as Sufism, a more mystical, kind of experience-based form of Islam rather than observance-based form of Islam, a kind of ecstatic experience. That's the thing that inspires the mystic, is this direct contact with God. Anyway, the Almohads become the dominant political force in North Africa at that point. So this is a complicated history, and we can really kind of trace some of the more important developments in the history of Islam in North Africa as a kind of microcosm of the whole Islamic world. Now, North Africa, dominated by Islam, was rocked as Europe was, and other parts of the world, in fact, were in the 14th century by the Black Death. This hits Egypt, it hits North Africa with just as much ferocity as it does, Western Europe, which, I think we know more about, probably kind of popular culture, has these images of the Black Death, maybe informed by Monty Python or something, but, the population takes a massive hit. Possibly, a fourth to a third, maybe even half of the population of some regions of areas hit by the Black Death were killed by this disease. So this, weakens the political entities and allows for new ones to take their place, the Mamluks in Egypt, and eventually the Ottomans, who come to control much of North Africa. Now, there are a couple more regions that I want to discuss here in connection with the spread of Islam. These are places that Islam comes to somewhat later than it does to Egypt and North Africa. We noted that Egypt, North Africa get Islam by the middle of the 8th century. These are some of the earliest conquests, and really, the driving places geographically of the whole religion. By about 1100 or so, though, Islam has spread across the Sahara via the trans-Saharan trade routes. Now, I noted these, kind of the beginnings of these with the ancient Garamantes, the Berber groups who would, cross the Sahara. They knew the lay of the land. They knew where the oases were and how to avoid sandstorms or take protection from them, and essentially figured out how to get across. That journey across the Sahara is not unlike crossing an ocean. It involves similar kind of lore, similar kind of knowledge, the ability to navigate by the stars and such, right? And so, sorry for the yawn. Why do this, one might ask? Well, it's because the regions south of the Sahara had, historically, a lot to offer in terms of trade. Okay? From all the way back to ancient times, we talked about the trade in animals, African animals that were eventually killed in the gladiatorial arenas of Rome. There are significant salt deposits in the Sahel. Salt is, of course, a necessary substance for all human beings. We have to have salt in order to live. And yet salt is, something that must be found. It's not something that, grows, right? So there were salt deposits, and from the ancient times, there were also sees the trade in human cargo, that is chattel slavery, something we will talk about in much greater detail in due course here. By the 9th or 10th century or so, massive gold deposits were discovered in the Sahel, in the area along the Niger River. Now, the Niger is not shown here. The map shows instead roughly the modern nation-state boundaries, which of course were not in place at this point, but you can sort of follow the Niger by looking at the cities here, right? And also the Senegal River that goes off over here to the west. But by about the 10th century or so, there are a series of kingdoms in the Savannah region, the sub-Saharan Sahel here, right? One of these is Kanem, which is over here further to the east. Another one is centered on the city of Gao, which is right on the Niger. But the most important of these by far is known as the Kingdom of Ghana. Now, please note that the medieval Kingdom of Ghana was not located in the modern nation of Ghana. Right, this is Ghana. The modern nation of Ghana got its name from this ancient kingdom, or rather, from the ruler of Ghana, who was known as the Ghana, right? But this was an African, traditional African kind of political name that the modern nation of Ghana chose in the 1950s when it became independent. The actual kingdom of Ghana was here along the Niger, and over here into, between what is now Mali and what is now the Western Sahara, right? Anyway, the key to this kingdom was the control of the gold supply. In fact, in Ghana, and I had you read, or assigned you to read a short couple of selections called Glimpses of the Kingdom of Ghana, which talk about the Ghana himself, who was an important king, really ruled over a fairly large kingdom. The key to his political authority was his control of the trade in gold. That the Ghana kept his thumb on all of that and procured the largest amounts of profit from the gold, and thus kept himself in power, right? By doing what Africans do politically, and that is shower favors upon a network of kinsmen and friends and people they were trying to incentivize to remain in the same area and support their control of power, right? This is an important uh, instance of that sort of political power, or the control of power. Power over people, again, not power over land. Gold was key to all of that, as eventually slaves will be to many of these kingdoms in West Africa too. Now, the Kingdom of Ghana persisted for a couple of centuries, toward the end of which Islam begins to make serious inroads into West Africa. The Ghana himself, it seems, entertained the idea, or some of the ideas of Islam, may have embraced some of them, though he, never ceased to worship his ancestral gods. Truthfully, we don't know nearly enough about the Ghana or the Kingdom of Ghana. There are scant records about this, but so some of this, has to be traced through oral histories or oral storytelling or other means. But it's fairly certain that, in the major trading centers and probably among the elites, these Berber merchants shared their religion and didn't necessarily make converts, but instead Islam takes on a syncretic form here. Syncretism, if you don't know the definition of that word, it means kind of a mixture of things, right? Especially applicable to, culture and to religion and things like this. Well, so Islam, rather than, being the religion that becomes dominant kind of in its pure and wholesale form, some parts of Islam are adopted by the elites in Ghana, maybe even by the Ghana himself, though he retains, other facets of his traditional religion, right? Now, in some centers here, Muslims do begin to set up schools and mosques and other things in West Africa. This becomes even more so under the Kingdom of Mali, and I'm not going to treat the Kingdom of Mali fully in this lecture. I'm simply sort of pointing forward to the future here, to the next lecture, and to the reading in Sunjata, right? But you can see that all of these key cities along the Niger here, Djenné, Timbuktu, Gao, and other places, were not only key population and trade centers, they were also centers of Islamic scholarship, and the building of mosques and the performing of the rituals of the Islamic religion. One of the great monuments, in fact, of the African continent is what is known as the Great Mosque of Djenné. Djenné being, of course, one of these cities, right? It can, by the way, be spelled with a D at the beginning of it, okay? Note the different spellings there. It just depends on how you transliterate it. But Djenné, this mosque was built, I think, in, the 12th and 13th centuries initially, something like that. And it takes its inspiration, actually, from termite mounds. It's made of mud, but very carefully crafted so that it's dried and very well preserved. Actually, quite permanent as a structure. And this thing has stood now for 800 years or so. And it's quite large. Fits a huge number of people inside for worship services. I think still in operation today, although it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site as well, and probably visited by tourists who can, get to the Niger River, right? So, Islam begins to spread via these kind of key cities and the networks of worshipers and scholars who live in those cities. All right, there will be plenty more to say about West Africa, about the spread of Islam into West Africa. This is one of the things that I would like you to take a look at as you read Sunjata, is, what in Sunjata is Muslim, right? What parts of this text have been influenced by the presence of Islam, and what parts are, retain the kind of traditional culture that was pre-Islamic. Now, Islam also spread into East Africa, and this is another key region for historic Islam. And the east coast of Africa received the religion largely because it was tapped in, even anciently, to the trade all through the Indian Ocean in a variety of goods. Right, the Indian Ocean trade is tremendously important for Africa, much as the Mediterranean forms this large trade archipelago in the West. The Indian Ocean forms its own trade archipelago, linking up areas as geographically diverse as Indonesia, Southeast Asia, India, the Arabian Peninsula, right, and the east coast of Africa. And it's via the seaborne trade that Muslims began to move into East Africa. Muslim merchants seeking goods in the interior of Africa build cities on the coast and use those cities as ways of, procuring and trading in goods, gaining wealth for themselves, but they also take the Muslim religion there, right? And so the Arab development of the coast, the building of cities, lots of cities on the East Coast date back many, many centuries to, in some cases more than a millennium, to the earliest incursions of Islam into East Africa. Places like Mogadishu, which is now the capital of Somalia, I guess you can call it the capital. Somalia doesn't have much of a stable government, but most important city, at least, in Somalia. But Mogadishu, and then further down the coast, places like Kilwa and Mombasa, both of which are now in Kenya, and much further to the south, eventually Sofala and Zanzibar and other places like that. Right, these are all developed by these Arab Muslim traders. You can see the image on the left here. They build mosque architecture. This one inspired by mosque architecture from other parts of the Muslim world, with the arches and things which are really more akin to something you might see in the Mediterranean region. But that knowledge spreads into East Africa via these Islamic networks. Kilwa in particular becomes a kind of trading capital on the east coast of Africa in the early part of the second millennium, in the 11 and 1200s, something like that, maybe a bit earlier than that in some cases, or with respect to some things. Now, the other thing that we have to note about East Africa here is that the Arabs of the coast, although they wanted to procure goods from the interior, like slaves and gold and specialty items like ivory and rhinoceros horn, perhaps, which was traded, marketed all over the Indian Ocean for various medicinal uses, especially considered an aphrodisiac for male sexual dysfunction. That's a historic thing. It's also a very tragic thing. This is the main reason that the rhinos, some species of rhino, are so endangered, and some are nearly extinct because of the demand for their horn. But those are specialty items, and they grow in popularity over time, but really gold and slaves and a few other things, but mostly those are kind of the key materials that the Arabs of the coast wanted to procure. And so they communicated with people of the interior, whom they called in Arabic the Zanj. That's the Arabic word for these, native African peoples of the interior. But they didn't necessarily move into the interior. They kept themselves along the coast, not wanting to mix with the Zanj. They considered the Zanj to be primitive. They considered them to be sort of demonic, devilish. They're I don't know that they were afraid of them necessarily, but they did not want to mix with them socially or sexually or anything like that. And so, these two communities kept apart except when it came to trade, pretty much. And I'm sure there was some, contact, even social contact between the two groups. However, this trade did produce some interesting effects, one of which is the development of a language called Swahili. Swahili is a Bantu language that developed out of the trade between the Arab and the Zanj. So it's Bantu, but it has a lot of Arabic loanwords, and the Arabs who wanted to trade with the Zanj of the interior would learn Swahili, and this is the way they communicated. This would eventually become a kind of common language or lingua franca of all of Central Africa. In fact, all the way to the present, it remains that, though there are also, because of the colonial era, a lot of loanwords now in Swahili from English and French, and perhaps Portuguese in some regions. And so, this is a sort of hybrid language, very interesting linguistically, for that reason. And so the net result of all of this, the spread of Islam, the creation of networks via this religion, is this massive trade network that stretches all across Africa. Now, I've titled this slide the African slave trade, because slaves were really one of the key commodities traded all across the continent. But that's not solely about the slave trade here. We can see that, we've got groups, kingdoms even in the interior here. We'll talk in a later lecture about, Great Zimbabwe and some of these other places, certainly about the Mali Empire, and more about Ethiopia, right? But these peoples of the interior trade via these trade networks, the Berbers, across the Sahara, sorry, I lost my train of thought there for a second. The various cities along the East African coast, Kilwa and Zanzibar and Mogadishu and Malindi and eventually Sofala, right? They get goods out of the interior and then trade them, to the north, across the Indian Ocean. In some cases, there are even linkages between East Africa via the Red Sea up here into Egypt, and then over into North Africa, even into West Africa. We will look at a few examples of the economic kind of results of this economic contact as we go on in this course. Okay, so I think that does it. Thankfully, that did not take. I was worried this lecture was going to run really, really long. So anyway, hopefully this has been enlightening. If you have questions, please address them on the discussion boards, and look forward to your comments.